Welcome to today's discussion, Financing the Future, Tackling the Global Education Crisis. My name is Safwan Masri and I'm Dean of Georgetown University in Qatar. Few things are as transformative or as unequally accessible as education. For those who have it, the benefits ripple outward, lifting entire families out of poverty, catalyzing innovation, and building nations. Yet, for the 7 in 10 children in low and middle income countries who cannot read or understand a simple text, it is a future cut short before it even begins. In places like Gaza, Syria, and Sudan, where education systems are often the first casualties of war, the challenges are even more pronounced. This stark reality is why we are gathered here today. Education is the foundation upon which society is built for a reason. It equips individuals with the knowledge and skills to build healthier lives, empower equality, drive economies, and strengthen resilience in the face of climate challenges. Despite these clear and undeniable benefits, the global education crisis persists. Direct aid to education actually fell in recent years, leaving us with a question that has grown in both its persistence and its scale. And that is, can we close a $100 billion funding gap and build systems that ensure every child everywhere can access quality education? This is where leadership matters. Qatar's transformative progress in education reflects the vision and leadership of Her Highness Sheikha Moza bint Nasser. Her guidance has enabled education above all to touch millions of lives and driven the groundbreaking work of Qatar Foundation, to which Georgetown University proudly contributes. But no single country or organization can solve this alone. This challenge demands that governments, international organizations, financial institutions, educators, and the private sector work hand in hand. To that end, today's distinguished panelists will explore innovative approaches to financing education and building pathways for meaningful global collaboration. I'm honored to introduce our panelists. Her Excellency Paula Ingabire, Minister of ICT and Innovation, Republic of Rwanda. Will you please join us on the stage? Thank you. His Excellency Fahad Al-Sulaiti, Director General of the Qatar Foundation for Development and until very recently, Director of Education above all. Thank you, Fahad. Ms. Laura Frigenti, CEO of the Global Partnership for Education. Dr. Hiba Ahmad, Director General of the Islamic Solidarity Fund for Development. And Ms. Fatima Yasmin, Vice President for Sectors and Themes, Asian Development Bank. Thank you all for being here this morning, and thank you all for participating in this session. And I really mean it when I say I'm honored to be on the stage with you, because you're on the ground doing work that really helps us move forward in the area of education and providing access to children around the world. If I may, I'm going to start with you, Your Excellency, Minister Ingabire. You, in your role as Minister of ICT in Rwanda, you oversee national digital transformation initiatives, including e-government and Kigali Innovation City. As I mentioned to you earlier, I had the great privilege of visiting your beautiful country and your wonderful city just before COVID, and I was quite impressed with what I saw, including in rural areas in terms of education and healthcare. Your collaboration with the Ministry of Education, you've collaborated on projects like Zero Out of School Children, through which you aim to enroll 177,000 children. So if you don't mind, let's talk about the public-private partnerships that undergird the work that you have been doing. They've been important all over the world in expanding access to tertiary education, and in Rwanda in particular. 57% of students are enrolled in private schools, if I'm not mistaken, in Rwanda. But there are challenges such as limited financing, lack of qualified teaching staff, absence of clear policies governing these partnerships. Are these partnerships between the public and private sector in education effectively improving access and quality of education, or are they falling short? And let me also attach another question to that, and that is the role of technology, because one of the ways that we try to provide access to education is through technology, but oftentimes there are prohibitive costs associated with having the hardware that allows that kind of access. So, talk to us about that, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. And let me start by thanking Education Above All for inviting us to be part of this session. I think just earlier before the session started, we were all saying, finally, we're going to discuss something with Laura, something that's very important for us because everything raises and falls on, the quality of education that we can afford our children. But a bit about, just a bit of a background, and I'll respond directly to the questions that you're asking. One, for nations to be able to achieve zero out of school children, it requires that there's that deliberate effort to tackle the challenges that are unique to any specific country in terms of barriers to access to quality education. I like the fact that you have underscored quality, because when we look at the statistics, I think we have about 258 million children globally that are out of school. And that reflects about 1 out of 5 children that are out of school. The question is, even those 4 out of 5 that are in school, what's the quality of education that they are getting? Because it's not merely just putting them in school, it's also making sure they have the skills and the tools that will allow them to thrive in society. Now, when you look at low-income countries, 60% of children, even in grade 3, for example, cannot read a simple sentence. So what does that mean for the future that we are creating for them, and how are they going to be able to thrive in such a future? And that's why I believe the conversation that we're having today is very important, and it should underscore the quality bit or the quality side of education. Now, when we look at Rwanda, particularly, we've been very intentional to ensure that there's universal access to education. And so this is through the 12-year basic education program that has been put in place. But with that has come also the strain on infrastructure. And coming back to your question on public-private partnerships, this is an area where we've seen the public and private sector coming together to address the growing demand and the strain that has been put on infrastructure. Just in 2020, we were able to build about 24,000 new classrooms to accommodate that growing demand that we had in Rwanda. But that's not enough, because I think what we're also looking at is how do we make sure that even the children that are coming to school are being retained. And so, similar to what we see across different countries, we're able to implement school feeding programs. And again, this is something where we saw the power of public-private partnerships, because also when we talk about public, it's not just the government, it's also the society. And here, the school feeding program, as an example, we had parents contributing 10% towards the school feeding program, and the 90% coming from a pool of funds from different partners. Even the school infrastructure I was telling you about, every last Friday of the month, we have what we call across the country a cleaning day. During cleaning,
Okay.
community cleaning, every last Saturday. And so of every the last Saturday of the month. And so what happens, you've also seen communities coming together to go and make sure that the school infrastructure is in proper shape.
Yeah.
And so, because we know you talked about the 100 billion funding gap, because it's the infrastructure that takes the bulk of that. And so these are some of the things where we've seen really truly the power of public-private partnerships coming into force. Now, my last 2 points are going to be on 2 things that you highlighted. And for us, when we think about education, empowering teachers is central to everything. And so whether it's from pre-service to in-service training, it's thinking about incentives, increasing their salaries, thinking about putting technology in their hands to support the teaching process, but also at the same time, really understanding that technology is going to be an equalizer and will help to improve the quality side of things. COVID was a perfect example on how education was one of the sectors that suffered the most. For countries, especially in low-income countries, where the only form of education that was left for children was TV or even radio, you can imagine how much of that affected the learning.
Because there's no
Exactly.
interaction.
There's no interaction that was happening. So when you deploy technology very well, you're able to bridge the gap between classroom learning and out of classroom learning. What we've done in Rwanda is to ensure that we have at least, we're working to make sure that by the end of this year, all of our schools are connected to high-speed broadband connectivity. We're well above 60% of those that are already connected today. But it's beyond connectivity. It's the laptops that children need. It's the content. It's the support that the teachers need. And that's the multi-pronged approach that we're taking to ensure that we can deliver quality education to our students.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Before I go to Fahad and the rest of the panel, let me, if I can ask you to comment very quickly on something I'd like us all to think about when we, talk about quality of education. We oftentimes, almost exclusively, focus on numeracy and literacy, right? Can they read? Can they count? Can they add? Uh, but quality of education is not only that. The quality of education also has to do with the values that undergird an education system. You mentioned cleaning, okay? And again, I'm not saying this gratuitously. If anybody hasn't been to Rwanda, you're missing out on something. I mean, it is one of the cleanest countries I've ever been to. And the thing that really amazed me, especially that I was born in zones of conflict in Jordan, and when you look at and you consider the genocide, which decimated 10%, I mean, decimated the population of Rwanda, and that was only 30 years ago, right? 1994. And you see how harmonious society is today. And I know that there have been reconciliation efforts and, facing the history of Rwanda and of the genocide, and the legal system and the court system internationally and locally helped a great deal. But very quickly, can you talk about the role of education in bridging the animosities, if you will, in bringing about this harmony?
That's very important. When you look at what happened in 1994, which was the genocide against the Tutsis, you had 1 million people that were killed in 100 days. And what we also see right before then is the fact that during that time, specifically for education, just a small segment of the population had access to, a small segment was denied access to education. And that was very important for us coming out of the genocide, to ensure that education was one of those where we make sure that everyone has access to quality education. So what is the role of education as we go forward? Even looking at the 30 years that we've gone through, one, when we talk about inclusion as Rwanda and the past that you've just, laid out, it was important that inclusion is at the heart of that agenda.
Right.
Now, through the different education channels, we've also been able to teach our young people the past, the bitter past that our country has gone through, and why unity and reconciliation are important. Today, when you look at 30 years, what we've been able to achieve coming out of the genocide against the Tutsis, no one, even for a kid that was born 30 years ago and is hearing and is learning about what happened then, no one wants to go back to that. Everyone has it in themselves to feel like they have the responsibility to safeguard the gains that we've gotten as a country, and to make sure that you are contributing to that prosperity.
Thank you. Thank you. Um, Dr. Al-Sulaiti, you've dedicated your career to education in various capacities, and I think it was 13 years that you were at the helm of education above all, and now with the Qatar Fund for Development. I have had the great privilege of working with you over the couple of years that I have been here already, and I've seen your commitment to expanding access to education for vulnerable populations. It's something you believe in. So my question to you, my opening question to you is, how can we protect education from being the first casualty of conflict? We've heard from the minister about the casualty, being education during the genocide in Rwanda. And related to that, how can we recover? How can we make up for the loss of educational opportunities for populations? Let's just take Gaza, where the infrastructure has been dismantled, destroyed, where you have children and adults who have lost so far 2 years of being in school. So, how do we protect education preemptively, and how do we react to a situation such as the one that we have in Gaza, but in Sudan, Syria, and so on, and make up for that lost opportunity?
Yeah, thank you very much, and I would like to thanks Education Above All for organizing this very, very important, and thank you for accepting to moderate this.
Pleasure.
We when we discussed this, I just want to start. When what you started today, the gap is $100 million. It is one, sorry, $100 billion,
Billion.
and actually it's 10 trillions now. Of overall. This is the annual budget gap. On the world. And I think the most important things is to say why this is gap happening. Okay, I think, and taking Rwanda as an example of that, Rwanda is a very good example of saying what their priorities, what they want to do, and how they can manage these things. But Rwanda is a good example, but there are other not good examples of other countries that they cannot take these priorities as a top, okay, and prioritizing exactly what they need. Okay, so for example, you mentioned the infrastructures. The chunk of this budget of trillions is the infrastructure issues. And I think that infrastructure should not be a barrier for us to say, they have been destroyed, this infrastructure, there are no schools, so we cannot study. This is the big issues happening. If we don't have infrastructures, still we'll have the book, still we'll have the pen, okay? Still we'll have a qualified teacher there who can teach, who can go for that. And I think this is what we need to really go for and to see to the people there are different paths that you can go with it, not only with the infrastructures issues, because we will not fulfill this gap. Okay, I'm coming from financial backgrounds, and we tried a lot to see what's the priorities for these countries. I think the first thing that we need before we think about innovating or financing, how can we bring bonds? How can we bring social impacts? How can we go for, a different mechanism in the financing? I think first of all we need to sit with the Minister of Education and to see how they can prioritize what they can do today. I think this is the first step, and then link them with the Minister of Finance. Always we see accelerated of the budget, coming from the Minister of Education, and there are no direct link between Ministry of Education and Ministry of Finance. You see, always the budget is very high, and really it's need a big experience, of how you're going to do your budget. That's why the gap is increasing and increasing. And unfortunately, when I started, as you mentioned, maybe 13, 14 years ago, it was a 3 trillions the gap only, and now we're talking about 10 trillions. All the efforts that, as you mentioned, started, Her Highness put a huge commitment in the beginning to close that gap. Others like GPE and all our partners are putting all these efforts, but the gap is increasing. There are lots of barriers. One is the conflict. Number of population is increasing in the worldwide. You see, the numbers is going to increase and increase. Shift of the priorities, unfortunately, people going not to taking education as top priority now. We see climate is taking more, on the huge wave, and still education remaining the same. I think because education is not moving from traditional way. And traditional way is to have schools and teachers. No, I think as you mentioned today, we have a technology minister here, and I think the future is to go to this effort and how can we leveraging together. We need to have more partners and more commitment coming from big countries. Thanks for Canada, and we've been in a very strong collaboration, with the Canada. I was 2 months ago in Canada, and we have this talking about what can we do in the G7, G20, how can we prioritize education there, education-wise is priorities on this. But just to come back to you about the conflict issues, and how can we, I think again, we need to prioritize educations, not on the infrastructures, because what's being destroyed is destroyed. We cannot rebuild it directly after 2 or 3 years. I think the priority for us now is to go for the teachers, qualified teachers, support the qualified teachers, giving them the basic of what they need, okay, to make it right. All right. And then I think this is the step that we need to take further of how can we mobilize the children then from the key component,
100%.
physical
Yeah.
support that we are giving this children. And the most important things is the youth playing a big role in that.
Yeah.
Mobilize the youth. They can empower more. They have the gap of average, between the teachers' age and the children age. The youth can play a big role here, of conveys, the children to go back to school. And this, especially what's going on in Gaza, we have tested this. Now, Syria, unfortunately, we have seen what's going on, and today we've been talking with lots of partners of how can we interfere on that. There are huge people coming back from different other countries, coming back to their countries. How can we support them? How can we provide them with a quick education? And the issue is that I don't think we should call always things an emergency. Emergency is always is there. What solutions that we have today that we can put forward for this innovative ways of
Thank you.
financing. Thank you.
Thank you, Fahad. And you're absolutely right. I mean, infrastructure is only part of the solution, but it's not all about brick and mortar, right? And we have to be innovative. And in listening to you, I'm very proud of the mobilization of the youth. So I'm very proud of a program that we started with Palestinian evacuees from Gaza, who are being hosted in Qatar, and there are thousands of them. Requiring medical care, and they're here with their caretakers and oftentimes with their children. And, they're lacking educational opportunities. So, for one, it's a small thing that we're doing at Georgetown, and that is providing English training and preparing those who want to pass the English qualification tests. And we just finished one cohort of that. And the people who are working with them are our own undergraduate students at Georgetown, and some of our alumni and some of our staff. And it's amazing. And, I remember in the cohort, there's one kid, Ahmad, who's 16 years old. He and his father are enrolled in the program. So you have mothers and you have children. And this is to your point about sort of being innovative about it. But you talk about the financial gap and you talk about financial models, right? And that's a great segue into our next speaker, Laura Frigenti. You're CEO of Global Partnership for Education, and you've had more than 30 years of leading global development initiatives, education in low-income countries. And you've worked a lot on accountable, innovative funding strategies. Now, we know that on average, the education sector receives less than 3% of humanitarian aid, less than 3% of humanitarian aid. And direct aid to education has fallen 7%, as I mentioned, over the past few years. This is despite momentum behind initiatives like the International Finance Facility for Education, which was launched 2 years ago. And it aims to leverage donor contributions sevenfold and unlock 10 billion by 2030 for education projects. So donors are saying that education is a priority. Okay, there's no question about that. They're all saying it. Is that lip service? I mean, just to be a bit provocative, does their funding tell a different story? What's holding them back? Let's start with that, and then I'd like to come back to you with some more specific questions about financial innovativeness.
Thank you so much. I don't want to say that it is lip service, but I think that there is a different perception of education compared to other crises. So when I, for example, meet the leaders of the world that I visit, knocking at their door, asking for resources, they all acknowledge that education is important. But somehow they feel that the education crisis is a less global crisis than other crises. So climate change is global, and so it needs to be tackled with global resources. So is global health and pandemic. Education is somehow a crisis that is perceived as localized individuals. So the children of Niger don't have access to education. That's a very sad thing for the children of Niger, but somehow that crisis remains confined to that country. And I think that this is really the great mistake and the great misperception, because the reality is that the children of Niger who do not see any opportunities for their future, they are starting looking for alternative options. And so they will either come and knock at your door looking for better opportunities in countries where they see that these opportunities may be available, or maybe, join different ideologies, different movements that give them a sense that they can shake the status quo and therefore provide better opportunities for themselves in that particular context. So I would say that a little bit of the problem, and I think is also a responsibility of the education community. We have always been advocating education as a human right and has something that is important for individual. Education unleashes the opportunities for each and every one of us. And that is obviously true. We know each and every one of us is here because education has given us the opportunity to be where we are. But in reality is that if you look at the aggregate impact of education on society, education is the greater equalizer in society. It reduces inequality. It generates global growth. It generates stronger institutions. It generates better political debate and therefore leads to processes that I hope drives towards democracy. It improves, societal well-being. It creates better citizens. And I could go on and on and on and on benefits that are positive externalities of education and that are just not related to the simple learning that happens in the classroom. And I think that the leaders of the world needs to be reminded of that, because then they would see that a lot of the dramatic structural problems that we are trying to solve now and that we see unfolding now, even today, even yesterday on the screens of our televisions, well, those should be addressed and could be addressed to better investments in education.
Thank you. So, governments around the world did commit, at least during the Incheon Declaration, if I'm saying it correctly, which was adopted at the World Education Forum in 2015, to allocate 4 to 6% of their GDP to education. But we know that in many, many countries, whether it is as a percentage of GDP or the annual budget, it falls way below that. There is investment in health, right? Again, not enough, but you also see large organizations around the world like the Global Fund, the Vaccine Alliance, Gavi, dedicating themselves and their resources towards healthcare. How can we make education at the same level as a human right? Because you mentioned human right as health. And what lessons can we learn, perhaps, from the investments in health, briefly?
Well, I think that we need to really rethink about the financial engineering for the sector. Education, and I'm actually glad that we are having a conversation here in Qatar, because here there has been probably one of the most advanced thinking around innovative financing for the education sector, well before the international community started thinking in these terms. Education has always been funded on a kind of a grant basis. You get $1 from a donors in and you give that dollar out to another country. This model is dead forever because there is just not enough money around the table. So the challenge is how to make sure that we leverage so many resources that otherwise we wouldn't be able to actually leverage. And then the other thing is attracting to the education sector funds that wouldn't necessarily go to the education sector. And I know that my colleague is going to talk about this wonderful partnership that we have with the Islamic Development Bank and the Arab Coordination Group, which has actually been able to attract a significant amount of financing from the investment funds of the GCC countries, people that probably under normal circumstances would have funded roads, would have funded infrastructure, would have funded other things, but that because they are so close of the private sector and understand the connection between building the skills that then the private sector is the first user
Right.
of what the education produce. So if there is a shortage of, the right skills that are needed, then the private sector is the first one that suffers. And so they have actually been very, forthcoming in financing initiatives in education. And I don't want to say more because I know that she's going to discuss about that. But what I'm saying is that we are really trying to think in a different way. You mentioned IFID, that I think is a mechanism that it hasn't started operating yet, but we hope, and actually GPE is keen to, give them some grant resources that will allow them to put the whole mechanism in place. Guarantees is a great potential. We have been looking for other type of innovation. Our multiplier has been able to raise $4 billion, leveraging with different sources of financing. And we have to continue doing that. I mean, we were talking with Fahad yesterday. This is just the beginning of thinking on innovation, and we have to continue thinking about different instruments and different ways of doing that. The other point that I do want to say, to be fair, is that education is a sector that has also always been very inefficient in managing its resources. 16% of the resources that are invested in innovation are spent in an inefficient way and could in itself generate a significant savings. So one of the things that we at GPE are doing, raising funds, working with governments on domestic financing, helping countries spend better and more judiciously the resources that they have.
That's an incredibly important point, and one we'll come back to later on, and it really rhymes with what Dr. Sulaiti was saying about sort of the reliance on traditional ways of thinking about infrastructure. Maybe there are more efficient ways to provide access, but let's talk about financial innovation. And Dr. Hiba Ahmed, not only are you the director of the Islamic Solidarity Fund for Development, but you were Minister of Finance in Sudan. So you bring that background, that diversity. And to Laura's point about being more efficient, I think we also need to be innovative in a way that is culturally appropriate, right? Or where we can leverage different cultural norms. So let's talk about sukuk, or Islamic bonds, Sharia compliant financial instruments. They've been used to fund development projects, haven't they? And they offer potential for sustainable education financing. So if we look at sukuk as one of the examples of innovative financing tools that are available to us, can you talk to us about how successful have those been? If they are, will they continue to operate in a niche sort of manner, or can they become mainstream?
Thank you very much for having me here today, and thank you for Education Above All for inviting me. In Islamic Solidarity Fund for Development, we actually focus on grants and concessional financing, and we cover 57 member countries of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Unfortunately, our region is very kind of special because we host the most of the global poor. In addition to our region actually either exports or hosts more than 50% of the global refugees. Hence, the gap is really widening by the day, given that concessional resources are getting smaller and smaller, while the needs are getting larger and larger. Hence, we needed to be really, we operate in the field and we learned 5 main lessons. The first lesson is that we need to be very innovative in the way we mobilize resources and the way we spend them. We cannot do it alone. The second lesson, that's why we have partnerships with Education Above All and GPE. For example, we need to be looking always for sustainable resources to finance education for long-term impact. And of course, we have to be efficient in the use of limited resources so that we have more per dollar spent. And finally, we need to complement what others are doing, not duplicate. This brings me to how we can use Islamic financial instruments for scalable and sustainable and adequate resources for education. We in the Islamic Solidarity Fund for Development, we specialize in mobilizing resources through Islamic financing instruments. The first one you mentioned, the cash waqf sukuk. The cash waqf sukuk, just for simplicity, you can view it as a bond. Of course, given that it should be Sharia compliant, and it provides us with kind of good opportunity to mobilize resources from a diverse set of stakeholders, such as philanthropists and organizations. The sukuk can be education targeted. You can just issue a sukuk just for education sector, or it can be outcome targeted. You can issue sukuk just for a very specific outcome, such as increasing enrollment rates. But there are so many other social financing instruments that are Sharia compliant. I would like to also talk about the development waqf. The development waqf is a long-term sustainable source where you preserve your capital, you never spend the waqf is there, and then you can just use the returns coming from the waqf over and over to finance education and other sectors. You can have a regional waqf, such as the one we are thinking, inshallah, to launch with the state of Qatar, just to, for education purposes and other purposes, but you can put a certain amount out of the waqf for education. Or you can have it also as for just one outcome, where the returns are just used for a very, very specific outcome. Of course, we cannot forget when we speak about Islamic social financing instrument, we cannot forget zakah, sadaqat, and hibat. The zakah is a very important because it's a mandatory contribution, alms giving. It's mandatory alms giving. However, it's very special in that it needs to be spent within the year where you collect the zakah. While the sadaqat and hibat are more flexible, they are voluntary alms given. However, you can spend them very flexibly. These two complement each other. We do have a product that we are launching. It's called Insafi, that we will be leveraging zakah, hibat, sadaqat together, so that, for example, the zakah, because we have to spend in the same year, can be used for operational cost, for school feeding, for things that you can do within the year, while the hibat and that complement this, for example, for building infrastructure and so on. Now, let me end by giving you our own experience as a waqf. Islamic Solidarity Fund for Development is a waqf. It's a $10 billion waqf. We use only the returns from the waqf. Number one. Number two, we always have a certain preserve ratio for our capital, so that we hedge it against inflation, exchange rate fluctuations, and investment, And the good news is that since you have this sustainable funding coming, you can always use it as a seed to bring other stakeholders. Our leverage ratio stands at 1 to 6, helping us, to support education and other sectors.
And you said it's 10
billion. Yes, sir.
And for everybody to know, waqf is endowment, right?
Yeah.
It is an Islamic endowment. That's amazing. That is, in Sudan, obviously, you're dealing with many of the same issues that we talked about earlier in the context of Syria or Gaza, because of conflict and because of war. I'm fascinated by the fact that, your background is in finance, and our next speaker, Ms. Fatima Yasmin, was also finance secretary of Bangladesh. So back to your point, Fahad, about the coordination with the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Education. And so we have three of our panelists who have finance in their backgrounds. In your case, Hiba and Fatima as former ministers of finance, and in your case, Fahad, as having worked in the private financial sector before joining Education Above All, and your successor at Education Above All, Dr. Muhammad Al-Qubaisi, came from the finance arm of Education Above All. So, that's a really important and interesting sort of reinforcement of the notion that we need to be financially and fiscally very innovative when it comes to education. So with that, Ms. Fatima, let's talk about the unprecedented debt burdens that developing countries have. And in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, they amount to 60% on average. There are models like social impact bonds, right, which tie funding to measurable outcomes. There are debt for education swaps as another sort of innovative financial tool. In the swaps case, external debt is forgiven in exchange for investments in local education. We heard also from the minister from Pola about the private sector contributing, for example, in innovative ways to improving conditions in schools. Are these models effectively addressing the needs of rural schools in particular and conflict zones, perhaps? How well are these things working? And if you can maybe expand from that or talk about whatever you'd like to talk about in terms of your experience in a country like Bangladesh and beyond, because you're working for the Asian development borders.
Thank you very much for your question. I am representing here Asian Development Bank, and I can shed some lights that how Asian Development Bank is contributing. It has how it is contributing for the improvement of education sector in its developing member countries. We have, kind of the lending program. We have grant program. But combined lending and grant program is not enough for the developing member countries. We need more. And how we can supplement more, how we can reduce the gap of the need. So the innovative tools that is used by Asian Development Bank, that is for improvement of the quality. We have two separate issues. One is the access, other one is the quality. So the first one we are doing, that is for the quality, that is we have a kind of performance based loan. We call that is result based loan. So the result is tied for disbursement of, getting the next tranche of financing. So that is very much there. We are, in this way, we are tackling two problems. One is access, second is continuity or retention, and third one is the completion of the cycle. Maybe it's the primary education or the secondary education. So this is there in the result based. And the second innovative way we are doing that partnership with other organizations so that we can mobilize more resources for the education sector. You said there are other priorities and where somehow education is not getting the priority it should get. And you all will be knowing that we will be miserably failing achieving our SDG goal 4, which is our target for education. Here we are, the innovative way we are partnering with our development partners. We have sector-wide program in Bangladesh and Nepal where we are partnering with many development partners. It's World Bank, ADB, we have GPE. We during COVID, we have in Bangladesh, there was sudden increase of out-of-school children, disrupted the education system. And what happened, the ADB and EAA, our joint partnership, we are able to enroll 570,000 children in the school setting.
570,000.
570,000.
Out of school children are now back in school through the partnership with Education Above All.
Two more examples. One is our program in Pakistan. We are supporting Benazir Income Support Program, which provides cash incentive to around 5 million families. And here our expectation is increase enrollment, keeping them in school, accelerate learning program for out of the school children. Two more examples. In Philippines, ADB is providing conditional cash transfer program to 4.4 million families who are living below poverty line. And one of the conditions is they need to send their children regularly to the school to get this cash transfer. I could not finish without touching about Afghanistan. We recently approved a project for Afghanistan. It's a $111 million project. It will be to continue delivering essential education services to Afghanistan. The name of this program is Sustaining Human Capital Project for Afghan People, and the expectation is to expand community-based education services and deliver vocational training to enhance the employability and the employment opportunity of the children and youth.
Oh,
So this is just a
thank you.
few examples, and the last but not the least, we have just inked a agreement with EAA a few minutes ago, and under this partnership, we will be supporting our member countries to have addressed out of school children skill development and helping them in tertiary education.
Thank you. Thank you. So a lot of your work requires cross-border collaboration, right? Which isn't easy. I mean, and I want to come back to each of the panelists and ask about that. But I'll start with you, if you don't mind, Fatima, just very, very quickly. I mean, how do you cut through the red tape? How do you get to, um, you know, achieve cross-border collaboration in the work that you do?
Is scarce. You have to be innovative. So that is how we are helping Pacific Islands. This is an excellent example of both cross-border collaboration as well as the regional partnership in addressing shared challenges, especially for marginalized and out-of-school children. ADB provided technical assistance to fill the gap and optimize the benefit which is existing in the region in small Pacific island. We have created a platform for online classes and assessment for the students for all 14 ADB Pacific member countries. This Pacific Regional Education Program is known as PACREF, and it is implementing in collaboration with Global Partnership for Education, University of South Pacific, the Pacific Community, UNESCO, and UNICEF. This online platform will address some of the key challenges such as quality, availability of the teachers, inadequate school infrastructure, curriculum issues.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Laura, I mean, Fatima mentioned the Global Partnership for Education. How do you, in the work that you do, ensure regional collaboration and also that you basically, do your funding and the kind of work that you do is local as well. So how do you do regional collaborations? How do you ensure in the various, I mean, it's there are diverse local funding gaps, right? And there are international organizations, including UNESCO, UNICEF, the World Bank, but also at a very at a broader level, right? And outside of those large organizations, how do we create regional partnerships? And at the same time, and this is a question for all of you, I'm going to ask you in your contexts, ensure that there is learning and that there isn't duplication of effort. So it's really about collaboration, learning from one another, and adapting that learning to local circumstances or environments and not duplicating efforts.
Well, I think that all the points that you raised are absolutely critical in a sector that has many players, maybe too many, and where the risk for duplications and conflicting messages is very high. So I always say that the most important letter in GPE is the P, the partnership. That is the way in which we work, both at the macro level and at the local level. So at the country level, we create these local education groups that brings around the table government and all the actors that are interested in working in education. And that involves everybody, involves those that put money on the table, funders, involves those that are implementers, civil society organization, international NGOs, involves teacher association when they are interested, private sectors. And then the name of the game is to agree on one strategy to transform the sector that everybody is going to contribute to. That is super helpful for governments, at least this is what we hear from our partner countries, because the transaction cost of having 20 different tables and 20 different streams of work is just something that for structure that are absolutely weak is unsustainable. So that is one way of coordinating. That is replicated at the macro level, at our board. In our board, organizations of different types are present, private sector, civil society, Global South, civil society, funders, multilateral organizations, multilateral banks, and we agree on the key strategies. So that generates the agreement on the sense of direction. And then that gets translated at the country level.
Thank you. Thank you. Paula, if I can come back to you, and again, very quickly, how do you ensure, I mean, is there regional cooperation? Is what you do in Rwanda so specific to Rwanda that cannot be transferred elsewhere? How do you achieve cross-border learning and regional cooperation?
So a couple of examples that I shared earlier, a lot of them are what you learn from what's happening elsewhere. I think Finland, in a way, has also offered a perfect model of what an education system looks like. And some of the things we've seen them implementing, especially the Nordic countries, is also school feeding programs. And I think that's something that you see that has been scaled up across different countries that are looking to solve for barriers to education, but also making sure that you have a high retention rate of students within the school system. But then a couple of examples, things that we've done as Rwanda. One, we've benefited from bilateral engagements where from the point of enhancing the capacity of our teachers. Particular partnership that we have is with the Republic of Zambia, where we're able to bring in teachers that support with our education system, and that has allowed us to also build the quality that we're looking for. On a regional level, there are a couple of initiatives we've undertaken, and I know a piece of this conversation today was also around how you integrate technology in the classroom. One example is the collaboration between UNICEF and ITU called GIGA, which is around school connectivity. And the idea of that is picking like-minded countries that are having issues to do with the cost of connectivity, and then being able to create models of connectivity deployment that is affordable for these countries, and Rwanda was part of those. And what that helped us is when you think about the aggregated demand that can happen across the different countries, every school mapping their school needs, how many students they have, their connectivity needs, and then being able to pool resources to address that has allowed us to lower the cost of connectivity for our schools. We're now in conversation with UNICEF to think about device financing for students and teachers. And the idea again is to the aggregated demand of what is the number of devices that is required, let's say for 10, 20 countries. Right. And how do we use a similar model as Gavi to sort of bring down the cost of devices
Nice.
and make sure this is affordable for the
Nice.
students and the teachers. And so all of these are different partnerships that Rwanda has been actively engaging in, because we can't develop as an island, but also we know that the power of economies of scale, when it plays into force, can allow us to really bring down the same cost that we're discussing here of ensuring we have quality education. Let me use 1 minute to end on one thing that probably we didn't touch on, which is data. We live in a world where, with the right use of data, we can make targeted interventions. And our policy or our position as Rwanda is to ensure that we are using this data. We've built systems across the education system. Our Ministry of Education working with us, we're building data models that can guide where do we deploy efficiently the resources that we have to allow for impact on education, and being able to create multiple scenarios that will lead us to knowing that yes, the gap will probably always be there, but what's the best use to deploy the resources, the little resources that we have?
Thank you so much for bringing that up, because it also hits on the issue of efficiency and ensuring efficiency in how we do things. And what you were saying, Fahad, earlier about sort of moving away from traditional ways of thinking about education. And I've seen it actually in action in Rwanda in the healthcare system. Um, I'm going to go to Hiba and then conclude with you, Fahad, if I may. Hiba, I mean, talking about sub-Saharan Africa, are nations talking to one another in the area of education? Do you feel the need for greater regional coordination, or are the circumstances that different, politically and demographically and culturally and so on?
Definitely, thank you. For the Islamic Development Bank, by mandate, we operate in 57 countries. We are the only South-South cooperation organization that is AAA rated, meaning that by mandate, our region need to cooperate together for better impact. However, there is no one size fits all when it comes to education. Each country has its own specific circumstances and so on. However, we found out there are like 5 maybe or 6 lessons that you can use across different countries. The first lesson is that when you tackle education, you need to talk about the 5-legged model, meaning you cannot just go and build the schools and run away. You have to address, school environment, competency-based curricula. You need to address school leadership. You need to address policy and ecosystem, how education is put within this framework. And finally, of course, you need to put a lot of communication and advocacy for education. So this 5-leg system, actually, most nations find a way, here and there to be part of it. The second thing, in our special case, we target mostly poor countries and fragile countries. We found that the more you provide affordable financing, the more countries are more willing to take it from you. By this, I mean, as ISFD, we actually pioneer in blended financing. Our out-of-school children program blended $80 million of grants from Education Above All with 100 million concessional financing from ISFD. We're allowing the NGOs to operate on the ground. Our GPE multiplier model in Tajikistan, for example, blended 25 million grants from GPE with 45 concessional loans from IDB, and so on. Thirdly, we found out that the more sustainable the finance, the more government are willing to come around it. Because sometimes we offer financing for 1 year and you leave and then everything collapses. And this is, by the way, a very relevant fact for infrastructure. A lot of donors go and build schools and just leave. And then the school collapses because there's no operational cost, there is no spending on it. So the school collapses after 1 or 2 years. Hence, we use the WACF, as I mentioned, for example, as one tool for providing sustainable financing year after year, and so on. We have a very important program that is Vocational Literacy Program for Poverty Reduction, VOLIP for short. This one uses a WACF and a revolving capital for quite a number of years, and so on. So there are a lot of things you can put on the table to allow countries to collaborate and coordinate.
Yeah, no, and absolutely. And I think one of the ideas that's going through my head as I'm listening to all of you is how we think about education and infrastructure should be different. There needs to be a paradigm shift. Infrastructure is not only brick and mortar and technology. Teachers are part of that infrastructure, right? The curricula are part of that infrastructure. What we think about in terms of software and hardware, that we need to maybe think about differently. So Fahad, I'm going to ask you sort of say whatever you would like, address whatever you would like. You have the final, I'm giving you the final words. And part of the reason is because you have a bird's eye view, right? I mean, many of you do, and Laura in particular, I mean, you're looking at partnerships around the world, but through your experience with education above all, and more broadly, where do you see the challenges in terms of applying these financial models more broadly, mainstreaming them? Where do you see the opportunities for greater collaboration and learning, across countries? What?
Thank you very much for giving me to conclude. I think we need to think a more strong recommendation is that for the next sessions, not to call it only innovating for financing for education. It should be education and other sectors. Then from health, from other innovations to come together, of financing. So we can go, for example, sukuk or bonds, having a bond with a multi-sectorial approach. This is very important. I have, just to conclude, that I have visited a lots of schools. If the schools are not cooking, there are no feeding program. So the multi-sectorial approach is very important, and we talked with you, Laura, about it yesterday, of how can we, of the multi-sectorials, and how can we make last points, our futures, our success, to make this working together on this multi-sectorials, and we keep pushing for that. When the banks is talking, so Asian Development and Islamic Bank, we need them to refer to each other, you see. So they're referring to Laura, but we need them to be close, to say, I'm collaborating with Islamic Development, Asian saying the same, development banks. We're hoping one time that the banks will come together, okay, to leverage, because they are the people who's having the huge financing and leveraging together. And this is our mission, to make this happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for all your efforts, all of you. Really, I mean, thank you to the partnership, to the Islamic Development Bank, to all the governments and institutions that are represented here. And really, thank you to education above all. One of the things that attracted me about Qatar, just to take it personally for a second, is there's a commitment to advancing the state of education and healthcare in this country. And it's not only about Qatar or about Qataris, but the world. And I think there are lots of lessons to be gained from that. I've learned a tremendous amount. I wish I had another hour on stage with all of you, and I mean that. You've taught me to think about education in a different way, and the link between education and finance and innovation, public-private partnerships it's a cliche term in many, many respects, but I think you've helped put some substance and meaning behind it. And I hope that this has been as educational for our audience members, and that we look at this as the beginning of very important conversations to be had. So thank you for being here. Thank you for participating in this. And more importantly, thank you for all the great work that you are doing, because the future of this planet really depends on how we invest in its children, and the best way to invest in them is to provide them with the best education, provide them with the best healthcare, because unfortunately they're inheriting from us problems, including climate change. And if they're going to fix the climate and fix the way of the world, we need to educate them very well. Thank you so much. Thank you.